button, so it'll be like 30
Okay,
seconds.
I got it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for for the patience, Mark.
Oh, no problem. I hope this works. This is all an experiment.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, so we are live now. And we're at 7:03, so I think we can probably just jump right in. So hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for our Thursday night nature talk. My name's Caroline Hughes. I'm a biologist at the Loon Preservation Committee. And just a little background on us before we start the talk. LPC is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1975 in response to a dramatic and noticeable decline in New Hampshire's loon population. And sort of the founding principle was that if human activities had caused that decline or contributed to it, and it seemed very likely that they had, then human activities could also help to reverse it. And so that's what we've been working to do since then. We have a four-pronged approach. We do population monitoring, we do management activities, research into some of the problems that affect loons, and we also do education on loons and the natural world. And so this Nature Talk series is part of that work. And tonight we're so happy to have Dr. Mark Pokhurst with us. Mark is a veterinarian, a former professor at the Tufts School of Veterinary Medicine, the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. And he's someone who's worked extensively with Loons, has worked extensively with LPC and many other organizations throughout North America that are working on behalf of Loons. So Mark, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We're really excited to have you. And please take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Caroline, thank you so much for setting this all up. And I'm sorry that I can't be at LPC for this. It's always much more fun to do it than remotely. And I hope the internet connection works well. As I was saying to Caroline, I've been in the field for the last week, and I'm parked in the parking lot of the public library to try and get a connection. And basically what I wanted to do tonight is something a little bit different. I think we put that in the outline for the talk. You know, most of the loon talks that you've probably been to have talked about behavior and migration and wintering and all the wonderful things that loons do. But as Carolyn said, I'm a veterinarian. You know, I deal with live loons and try and, you know, when they have wounds or problems or poisoning, deal with all those issues. And then I am involved in working with LPC and University of New Hampshire and other groups to investigate deaths of loons. And so I wanted to sort of take you on an inside look tonight and think about some of the biology of loons from the inside out that affects their behavior and affects some of the things that we do and don't know. And I'll tell you, there is so much we don't know about loons. We know a lot more about their outsides than their insides. And so, Caroline, do I have screen control at this point?
Yes, you should.
Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Oh, not just yet.
Let me try this.
Oh, okay.
Now?
Yes, I see your PowerPoint now.
Oh, excellent. All right. Hopefully everybody else can see it too. So I will put us in slideshow mode. Is that working well?
I'm still seeing like the mode. Oh, there we go. Yes, there's just a.
Yeah, and Caroline, I have you. Okay, yeah, we're going in and out on the sound, so I hope everybody can hear all right. So basically, what I want to talk about today, as I said, is of loons. And you know, we can start. Here's a loon, a beach loon in non-breeding plumage. And just start with things like, well, what's the name from? You know, everybody assumes it has to do with the moon and the phases of the moon and crazy behavior like lunatic and so forth. And actually, that's not the case. If you go back to Norse languages, it comes from the fact that these animals are clumsy on land. And so lom or luma is the origin of this. These animals are just not built to be on land, and LPC knows that well. You know, other than loons that come on land to nest, if a loon comes on land, they're usually in big trouble. So let's see if I can get this to move forward. All right, maybe this control will work. There we go. So a little bit of history. I mean, this is the first illustration of a loon in North America. John White was one of the early explorers that came over for the Roanoke colony, funded by Queen Elizabeth and Sir Francis Drake in 1585, and painted this picture of a common loon off the coast of Virginia. And so here we are in 1585. People were noticing this big bird. You notice it's not anatomically correct, but there's no question that it's a loon. And of course, we use loon images for a wide variety of other things. And if there's any Canadians on the call, you know better than anybody else. Loons almost got to be your national bird, but they didn't quite win the vote. But I've got a lucky loony coin in my pocket. And we all love them for a variety of reasons. But let's start looking inside as to what these animals really are. And again, this is sort of how I know them from the inside. I've been working with LPC since the late 1980s and with lots of other biologists across the US and Canada. And so we have handled thousands of loons over the last 32 years, both dead and alive. And as you can see in the middle here, this is what LPC mostly does, is capturing the live loons and putting on banding and getting all the biomedical samples. And over there on the right are some of my students and actually a physician friend of mine, that when loons get in trouble and when loons are found dead, it's like CSI. We investigate the mortalities and try and decide why these birds have died and what we can learn from these birds to protect live populations. So let's think a couple of things about loons. One, you know that their name in Europe is the Great Northern Diver. And that's a better name than loon. So when you think about loons, think about a bird that is ultimately adapted to swimming and diving. There is no bird that is more specialized in swimming and diving than a loon, not even penguins. If you think about penguins, they can walk on land. Loons can't. Loons are the most specialized diving bird that we have, and you can see the placement of the legs and how they swim underwater. The other thing we know about loons, and I think probably almost everybody on the Zoom tonight knows this, is they don't fly a lot. When they're trying to escape predators, they dive. When they're trying to escape boats, they dive. They fly in migration, but in general, they don't like to fly a lot. Most of their lives, whether they're on fresh water in the summer or on salt water in the winter, are spent swimming and diving. And so what loons aren't really adapted well to fly. They're big, heavy birds. As all the LPC biologists know, these are birds that weigh, 4 or 5, sometimes almost 6 kilograms. So we're talking, 8, 10, 12 pounds. Big, heavy birds with relatively small wings. And so this is what we call a power to weight ratio. They're heavy and they don't have very big wings, and they have to generate a lot of power. So they have to run extensively to take off on this long runway. It's often said they need about 1/4 of a mile to take off. But of course, that depends on two things. One is how big and heavy the loon is. And two is if they're taking off into the wind, because they can get more lift if they're going into the wind. And anybody who does aviation knows this. If you look at these two aircraft, on the left, we've got a military fighter. Huge amount of power from those big jet engines, but look at those tiny little wings. If those engines shut off for a minute, what happens? The plane falls out of the sky. Without the power, it can't fly. Versus on the right, we've got a glider. With a long, long wingspan and no engine at all. And that plane can glide for hundreds of miles because it's got huge surface area on its wings and it's very lightweight. And we see this when we're thinking about birds as well. And it's all related. The issue of molt, when they change their feathers, the issue of how well they fly and how they fly, and the issue of what we call wing loading. Wing loading is a mathematical ratio, and you can probably see it in the upper right of the PowerPoint there. It's if you take the weight and divide it by the surface area of the wings, you get wing loading. And so loons have very heavy wing loading, small wings for a very heavy body, whereas the magnificent frigate bird down at the bottom has the lightest wing loading of all flying birds. And so it can glide for not only miles, it can glide for days without ever flapping. And the other thing that this means is for a loon to stay in the air, like the military aircraft, they have to keep their speed up. If they slow down, they fall out of the sky. They're not gliders. Whereas magnificent frigate birds could glide on and on without ever using any energy or flapping. So very different approaches evolutionarily to power and flight. What this means for molting is if you think of most birds, a bald eagle or a red-tailed hawk or a swallow or a magnificent frigate bird, when they molt, when they change their wing feathers, they lose a few at a time. And they can keep flying while they do that. Whereas with a loon, if they lose a few feathers, they can't fly. And so they've evolved something called delayed simultaneous wing molting, whereas in the winter, when they're on the ocean, they drop all their wing feathers at once and they're flightless. And so if we look at, this is wing loading here. I can see Carolyn is frozen. I hope the rest of you can still hear what I'm saying. I don't know how I can tell whether or not I'm coming through or not. Okay, Carolyn is unfrozen now.
Yeah, we lost you for a second, but we've got you back now.
Okay, so should I go back to the last slide? I don't know if everybody saw that. The one on wing loading and surface area?
We saw this. It actually froze just as you were transitioning into the next slide.
Great,
So.
okay. So when we look at wing loading, and here's just 4 examples, the bird with the heaviest wing loading is the common murre. It's got, you know, for each square meter of wing surface area, it carries 22 kilograms of weight. Now, common murre doesn't weigh 2 kilograms, but a common loon is next. Very heavy for the size of their wings versus a magnificent frigate bird. The magnificent frigate bird has about 1/5 of the wing loading of a loon. So very light bird for very big wings. And what you find here is that if you get a bird any heavier than a common murre or any smaller wings, they can't fly at all. And that's when you get into flightless birds like the Galapagos cormorant or penguins or the great auk, things of that nature. So here's a loon molting in the winter. This is one that came in for rehab. And Caroline, I think you're frozen again. So let's, again, I can't tell if people can hear me, so I'm just going to wait and sort of flap my lips. There she comes. All right. So we're back.
Okay, great. I don't think you ever froze. I think I just froze. So you're good.
Yeah, and I can't tell from the audience whether I froze or not. But this is a common loon in the winter, and you can see it has no flight feathers on its wing. This is a bird that came in on Cape Cod in the winter, and there are no primaries and secondaries. They're gone. So this bird is flightless for a period of several weeks while it grows new feathers. Now let's talk about skeletal adaptations, and we're going to want to talk about a series of things here. People often say loons have solid bones. That's not exactly true, but they're a lot more solid than most birds. And what we're trying to say when we say they have solid bones is the air sacs from the respiratory system don't go into the bones. So the bones are proportionally much heavier than most other birds. And this is, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is an X-ray of an adult common loon. And we're going to see some more pictures. The other one is they've got funny hips, and this contributes to why they can't walk. And we'll see this a little more on the next slide. But their femurs, their thigh bones here, have the legs sticking out to the sides. So they're not underneath them like you or me or a horse or a red-tailed hawk for standing. They've also got some other adaptations on their leg for swimming that makes them great swimmers, but means that they can't walk. We'll look at those in the next couple of slides. Another adaptation, and it doesn't have to do with flight so much, but loons have very thick skulls. And I think the reason for this is that loons fight a lot with one another. And their thick skulls are actually protection. It's like a knight's helmet. So when they're fighting and using those sharp beaks to poke at one another, they have some anatomic protection for their brains and their eyes. So here's just a quick, this is my art skills, so I apologize for that. But if you look at something like a red-tailed hawk or a chicken, and you do a cross-section of the body, you can see that the legs are sort of underneath the bird for carrying the weight. If you look at a loon, the femurs, the thigh bones, stick out to the sides rather than underneath. And this is part of why loons can't walk. They can't get their legs underneath them. So they can sort of push themselves forward and sort of throw themselves forward. And many of us in the field have been chased by loons that sort of throw themselves on the ground, but they can't walk. And consequently, they can't nest in trees, they can't perch on trees, they can't perch on power lines like a cormorant can do. They're sort of stuck on the ground and on the water. So let's look in a little more detail at some of these adaptations that we're talking about. So again, here's the hip joint. And one of the things that we note in this bird too, this area here, those are rocks. Adult loons always have a collection of rocks in their gizzards, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. But those rocks probably help them digest food, but again, nobody's quite sure why they swallow so many rocks. We'll come back to that. So here's the hip of the loon, here's the femur, the thigh bone. Whoa, I didn't mean to make that transition. Okay, this is the knee out here. And this is the tibia. This is the calf part of the new loon's leg. And you'll see projecting upward from the knee is this big point of a bone called the nemial tuberosity. The C is silent. And so this is part of a tibia, but it projects up here and the leg muscles attached to that. So the loons have a really powerful kick. So again, it's a wonderful adaptation for swimming, but it means they can't walk. Their muscles are totally specialized for swimming. We'll see this again in the next slides. Oh, let me go back one more. People often ask in a loon why this bone down here is not called the tibia like it is in you and me. Why is it called the tibiotarsus? And the reason for that is this. If you look at a baby loon, this is the ankle joint. You've got the tibia up here, and you've got the, oh, I have a misspelling. That should be metatarsus. Sorry about that. Those are the foot bones down here, and these are the ankle bones. And as the baby loon is developing, this row of ankle bones fuses to the tibia, and we call it the tibiotarsus. And this row of ankle bones fuses to the foot bones, and we call it the tarsometatarsus. So that's where the ankle joint would be in loons, and that's why this is called the tibiotarsus in adult birds in general. So here's that loon's tibia. Here's the knee. Here's the lower part of the tibiotarsus, and this is that big nemial tuberosity that is the projection for the thigh muscles to attach to, the muscles that extend and kick the knee. And if you see down at the lower right, I put sort of a seesaw diagram with an elephant and a mouse. And so I think we've all had this experience when we were kids sitting on seesaws about somebody heavy on the other side and you can't make the seesaw go up and down. So think about the tibia here as being a, whoop, why is it changing? Think about the tibia here, the tibiotarsus as being a lever, and that's the fulcrum. That's like the fulcrum here. And so we've got a big lever out here for the leg muscles to attach to for that powerful kick for loons to swim. So let's look a little further down the loon leg now. This is a cadaver of a banded loon, and you can see this foot, we've got the leg oriented so you're seeing the leg sort of front to back, and you can see how thin it is. Whereas the other side of the tibiotarsus is really wide. So it's sort of like a canoe paddle. It's wide this way, but skinny this way. And that's wonderful for streamlining for swimming, to pull it through the water. But if you look at this bone, the tibiotarsus, you see that little yellow line I put in there? That's all the part of the leg that's bone. This part in the front is all tendons, And this part in the back is all tendons. And so the bone is much thinner than the leg, and we'll see that when we proceed on. But you've got a very specialized lower leg here to make them really good, really efficient swimmers. I should say, by the way, if anybody's got questions during this talk, I'm happy to answer questions or get into discussion as we go. I'm not quite sure how to do that in a YouTube function, but hopefully Kelly and Caroline can help me.
So there has been one question so far, Mark.
Yeah.
It's not about what you're currently talking about, but it was about the molting of the feathers.
Yeah.
And they're flightless in the winter and they lose those feathers. Does that affect their ability to swim, dive, or avoid predators?
Great question. It doesn't affect their ability to swim. It doesn't affect their ability to dive. It only affects their ability to escape predators in that they can't get into the air. And loons don't usually do that to escape most predators, but theoretically, I could assume what happens if a shark comes up underneath you. It would be nice to be able to take off, and they can't. When they're molting like that, they can't. But I think what makes loons vulnerable on the ocean in the winter is the food supply doesn't always stay in the same place. The fish move. And if the loons choose a place to molt and then the fish leave, they're going to starve. They won't be able to feed themselves because they can't fly miles and miles to where the fish may have gone. And we see this in Florida and off the Carolina coasts every few winters, where the water temperature changes and the fish move, and we have significant starvation events with common loons. And they come up on the beach just totally emaciated and starving. And it's because the fish have moved. And a lot of us are concerned about that as a climate change issue. If the fish populations start to move and the loons can't adapt, we're going to have more winter mortalities on the ocean. So here we have the lower leg bone of the loon. What I've done here is I've taken this part of the leg and cleaned it off. And you can see here we are looking from front to back. And you can see how thick bone is. And here we're looking from the side. And if the flesh were on here, the leg would go from about here to God, keeps doing that. Would go from about here to way back over here, be much wider. But the bone is not so wide. It's mostly tendons that give that leg that flattened appearance and function when the bird's diving. And on this side, you have the extensor tendons to extend the toes and extend the leg. And on this side, you have the flexor tendons to bend the toes and to give a push stroke. We mentioned thick skulls, and I talked about loons fighting. This is an example, and I don't know if Caroline will remember this. This is a bird that came into LPC, and we took x-rays of it. As you can see, it's got 3 pellets from an air rifle in its head. And we thought initially this is what killed the bird until we did the post-mortem, and we found out that the skull stopped these. These didn't penetrate the skull at all, even though the bird had been shot from close range. These pellets hit the bone of the skull, and the bones of the loon were so tough, they stopped the pellet. And the pellets didn't penetrate inside. So loons have very thick, very tough skulls. And any pathologist or surgeon who's tried to get into a loon skull to look at the brain can tell you you need a bone saw to do it. It's a remarkably thick bone. So these pellets, even though they were shot from a fairly powerful air rifle, were not able to penetrate the loon's skull, even at close range. Now, the voice box. We all know about loons' calls, and I'm sure many of you have been at talks from LPC about all the wail and the yodel and what loons communicate, and all the work that was done by Judy McIntyre and Jay Mager and Bill Barclow and all the wonderful vocalization work on loons. It turns out that nobody has ever studied how the loons do the calls. And if you look at birds, and this is a general bird thing, a bird's voice box is not up here, like your voice box and my voice box. A bird's voice box is down in its chest, behind its heart, and it's called the syrinx. It's named after the pipes of Pan in Greek mythology. And so this is a loon that's been opened up. If you follow the trachea down, we've taken the heart out. It would normally be right about here. These two tubes, one goes to each lung. That's the left bronchus, and this is the right bronchus. And this is where the loon does those vocalizations. And this is how it's built. It's got modified cartilages, and then it's got membranes here, like the membranes on a clarinet reed that vibrate when air goes past them. And the loon can control the tension on those membranes using muscles here. And we won't get into the names of the muscles. Those aren't on the exam. But can control the tension on those to go woo, 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 sort of in thirds, the way that loons do so beautifully. But of course, a loon syrinx is much simpler than a songbird, like a robin or a blue jay or a nightingale, that have much more complicated and can do a lot wider variations. But no one has ever studied in a loon how the syrinx works and how they produce those sounds. Jay Mager and I started a project last year working with some students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and we've got a couple of studies ongoing now trying to figure out how a loon syrinx actually works to produce those sounds. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll know in a few years how that works. But this is one of those examples of, we've studied their sounds for over a century, but we don't know how they produce the sounds and how they produce those specific frequencies. Another thing we don't know much about is a loon's eye. You know, we've all looked at loon's eyes. We all think, oh, they've got these gorgeous red eyes. We love their red eyes. They're so striking when we see them. And if you pick up a lot of books about loons, many of the books say, oh, the red eye helps the loon see underwater. Well, it turns out that's not true. The red eye, if you look at any other diving animal, if you look at other diving birds like murres and auks and cormorants, if you look at seals, if you look at whales, diving birds don't have red eyes. It turns out that having a red iris does not help you see different wavelengths underwater. And then you ask, well, what other birds do have red eyes? And it turns out they're mostly terrestrial birds. Things like the superb starling in Africa, or they're not all birds. For instance, male box turtles have blood red eyes, just like loons do. And so it's for social communication. It communicates that an animal is adult and healthy and territorial and willing to be aggressive, to defend their territory. So it's behavioral, not visual. But the other question we come into is, how do loons see both in the air and underwater? And that's a much trickier question. And there's a guy in Wisconsin, Rick Dulbeck, who has figured this out. And this is one of his diagrams. Dulbezik, I'm mispronouncing his name. It's down at the bottom there. There we go. And what happens is they can actually change the shape of their lens. So in the air, this is the lens of a loon's eye. And this part up here is the cornea. This is the red part of the eye up here. And when loons go underwater, their cornea actually pushes on the front of the lens and changes the shape of the lens so that they can focus better underwater. And this is called, the fancy, if you're an ophthalmologist, the fancy word is accommodative lenticonus. So accommodative means it changing the shape of the lens to accommodate different wavelengths and different ways that the light is refracted. And lenticonus refers to the shape of the lens. So the loon's red iris can actually squeeze the lens into a different shape for seeing underwater than it does above water. And this is a marvelous thing to understand. And there's some other diving animals that can do this as well. This is not unique to loons. But we still have to figure out how loons' eyes turn red. It turns out nobody knows that. And that's a project that I'm working with Dr. Dubelzig on right at the moment, because it turns out that they're red in the summer. When loons are on the ocean in the winter, their eyes are a duller color. They're not bright blood red anymore. It's relatively described as sort of a gray-green or a hazel gray or something of that nature. when their reproductive hormones aren't going. And Dr. DeBelzig has figured out that there's one layer of cells that changes color, but we don't know how it happens yet. And so that's one of our next projects, is trying to figure out how they change eye color for breeding season. So there's so much we don't know about loons. Now, once you've got the eye, one of the questions is, are loons seeing what we're seeing? And the answer is no. A lot of people have investigated bird vision. Not many people have investigated loons per se. And the reason for this is you can't keep loons in captivity and train them and experiment on them. But another diving bird, the cormorant or the gannet, have been kept in captivity. They're very easy to tame and train. You think about Chinese fishermen who for thousands of years have trained cormorants to dive and catch fish for them. And so people have trained cormorants and used them in the laboratory to study their vision. And we've studied a lot of other bird vision as well. And so we're extrapolating now from cormorants and gannets and other birds to what we think loons are probably doing. And one of the cool things that birds can do that you and I can't do is they can see polarized light. I don't know how many of you have a pair of polarized sunglasses to cut down glare in the summer and things like that. Well, it turns out that birds in general and some other animals can see the difference between regular light. Regular light vibrates in all different directions. And when you put light through a polarizer, like your sunglasses, it cuts out all the vibrations except one direction. And that's why the light level goes down. And so birds can detect polarized light. And there's a couple of interesting things about this. One is that it turns out that when light, if you look here on the right, incident light, so this would be like sunlight coming in, and it hits the surface of the water, and when it bounces off the surface of the water, it's polarized. Hitting the water makes light polarized. And what this means is if you're a loon flying overhead, or a cormorant or a grebe or any other bird, it's like the surface of the water is flashing at you. It's like a neon light. It draws your attention because you're seeing the other things that are underneath you, like forests and deserts and things, don't polarize light, but water does. And so this helps loons focus in on where water is, and will help them to find places that they can set down, which is really great. One of the problems we have, and wildlife rehabilitators know this very well, and I'm sure Caroline has run into this and LPC has, is when it rains and there's water on asphalt roads, wet asphalt roads also polarize light. And a wet road looks like a lake to a loon. And so loons come down on parking lots and asphalt and they crash land and they can't take off again. And so there are some man-made structures like solar collectors, big solar fields or asphalt parking lots that look like water to birds flying overhead because the birds can detect polarized light. And so it attracts their attention. So this can be a death trap. And we have to figure out ways to build solar collectors and other surfaces that don't polarize light as well, that don't attract these birds to crash into it. But there's some advantages to being able to see polarized light. Here are two photographs, and this is done by a photographer. Here's just a photograph with a camera. And then what she did is she put a polarizing filter on her camera and took the same picture. Look at the difference in the window here on the left versus the window here on the right. So with a polarizing filter, that glass doesn't polarize the light anymore, and you can see right in just as well as you can see outside. And so this helps diving birds to see down into the water. It's like they've got polarizing filters on, and the glare of the water doesn't distract them as much. And so they can see fish and crayfish and other prey down below the surface better than we can because of their ability to see polarized light. So polarizing has both a negative effect in getting them to crash into things they shouldn't crash into, but it has a positive effect in that if they can see polarized light, they can see past some of the reflection on water's surface. Now, not only polarized light, but birds have another incredible ability that people are only just discovering, and that is the ability to detect magnetic fields. Whoa, stop that. We'll get to that next. People have known for a long time, since probably the 1950s, that pigeons and other birds could detect magnetic fields and might be able to use those magnetic fields in orienting for migration. We know marine mammals like whales and dolphins can do it, sea turtles can do it, and many birds can do it. But people are just discovering now how birds do it. And there's some very recent literature, just in the last couple of years. There's something in the back of the bird's eye, in the retina, the light-sensitive part of the eye, called cryptochrome pigments. And these cryptochrome pigments act almost like magnetic compasses, and they tilt with magnetic fields. And they generate little bits of electricity when they tilt. And so the birds can detect magnetic fields, how the pigments in their back of the eye react. And this diagram down here, and you have to realize this is make-believe. This is a representation. This isn't a real bird's vision. This is how we think birds might see. But scientists think that this is what a magnetic field might look like to a bird migrating overhead. They might actually be able to see the directionality and the curvature of the Earth's magnetic field because of these cryptochrome pigments in the back of their eyes. So they've got polarized light, they've got the ability to do magnetic orientation, and these two work together in helping birds migrate across great distances where there's no landmarks, across oceans, when there's clouds, all that sort of thing. It is just an amazing thing that we're just barely beginning to understand. And this is another one that was not discovered in loons, but we think it might occur in loons. We know this occurs in lots of other birds and in dolphins and in some other species. And it's what's called half-brain sleeping. You've probably seen loons asleep on a lake with one eye open like that, or maybe you've seen ducks that do the same sort of thing. And it turns out that for a lot of non-mammalian, well, I shouldn't say non-mammalian, dolphins can do this first. It was first discovered in dolphins in the 1980s. They can keep half of their brain awake and let the other half sleep and rest. So they'll have half brain that's asleep and that eye's closed. The other half of the brain is awake and alert and can detect predators. And so when you see a flock of loons or a flock of ducks or a pod of dolphins or something, you'll see that the animals on the outside of the flock always have their open eye facing away from the flock. They're facing towards where the predators might be coming from. So that half of the brain is awake so they can detect predators while the other half of the brain is resting. I wish I could do that. It would be amazing to be able to do that. And it's thought, nobody's ever studied this in loons, but it appears from the behavior that loons are doing this. It's thought that loons would do this at night when they're on the lake, but they may also do it when they're migrating at night. Imagine if they're migrating for, a whole night from one place to another. Wouldn't it be great if you're flying in a straight line to be able to let half your brain sleep for 10 minutes, wake it up, let the other half of your brain sleep for 10 minutes, and just take, I was going to say cat naps, loon naps, bird naps, whatever you want to call them, as you go along. What you'll see here down on the bottom, this graph, and you don't have to understand the whole thing, but the top red box here is one half of the brain. The bottom box that's not outlined is the other half of the brain. And see all the activity up here? That brain activity is bouncing all over the place. This is the awake half of the brain. This is the asleep half of the brain. So half of the brain is awake and paying attention and alert for predators while the other half is sleeping, and then they switch. And in birds that have been studied, like pigeons, this is roughly a 10 to 15 minute cycle. So little naps, and then they switch and go back and forth. So we think loons are doing this, but again, Nobody's ever studied. It seems likely, though. Now I was going to look at the loon's intestinal tract, the GI tract. Let me just take a look at the time. It's about 7:45, so we're okay. So a bird's stomach is divided into two parts. The upper part of the stomach is called the proventriculus, and that's where the acid is secreted. And the lower part, and you can see it's got really thick walls, is the grinding part. That's where all the grinding takes place. And if you look at this loon x-ray, the grinding part is where the rocks are. It's thick-walled and it's muscular for grinding its food. But if you look at most fish-eating birds like herons and gannets and petrels and things like that don't have muscular gizzards. And so we wonder, why do loons have muscular gizzards? And also, why do they eat rocks? Because most other fish-eating birds, like cormorants, don't eat rocks. So there's something different about loons, and we don't get it yet. We don't know why. So here's some theories. This is a side view of a loon x-ray. Here's the hip up here. Here's the shoulder over here. Here's the heart right here. And here's the rocks in the gizzard. And you can see how thick the wall of the gizzard is. But one thing is maybe they are using it for grinding food, because loons, in addition to eating fish, they eat crustaceans, things like crayfish, or in the winter crabs, or things of that nature that have hard exoskeletons that need to be ground up. So maybe they've got it for that. But maybe it's ballast. Maybe this is like a diver's weight belt that helps them be heavier to dive better. We don't know that. The third thing that we haven't looked at, but we're asking the question, is could loons be getting any essential minerals from these rocks? You know, the rocks contain things like calcium and magnesium and iron and phosphorus. And when the rocks are ground down and get smaller, maybe the loons are getting some essential minerals from that. So there are three functions that we're looking at. Maybe all of them are true. Maybe none of them are true. We haven't figured this out. But everybody's working on it and talking about it. And so when we do a post-mortem on a loon, we save all the rocks for later studies. And so we have boxes full of loon rocks. And here's a loon's gizzard cut open. Here's the proventriculus. Here's the thick-walled gizzard. Here's some rocks. And those are the lead sinkers that killed the bird. But here we go again. You see all the rocks, and again, lead and a piece of monofilament fishing line from this bird. But one of the interesting things about the rocks is they're often quite similar. You see that a lot of these are quartzite. Loons seem to be selecting fairly similar kinds of rocks. Now, this is pieces of crayfish claw here. There's some feldspar and some other things, but largely quartzite. So I need a geologist to help us do some studies on why loons eat the kind of rocks that they eat and what they could be getting from them. Now, this is an odd one. You can forget the pieces of lead in there that killed the bird, but I don't know if you can see, there's a lot of weird stuff. You see all these sort of curlicue shapes up here in this loon's, the upper part of its stomach and in its throat up here. Loons that are sick, whether it's sick from lead poisoning or sick from a disease, they can't catch fast-moving fish. And they often feed on slower-moving stuff. And in this case, it was snails. And so when you open up this loon, what you see is it's packed with snails that it picked up off the bottom. Those are not normal loon food, but this was a loon that was starving and hungry for anything. And these are not native snails. These are snails that are called the Chinese mystery snail. Okay, other interesting things about loons. And again, this is not just true of loons, but if you think about animals that live in the ocean water is salty. And if you or I drink all that salt water, we die. Our kidneys are not efficient enough to get the salt out of the water. Whereas if you're a whale or a marine mammal, their kidneys can take the salt out of the water and get rid of the extra salt. But with things that aren't mammals, like sea turtles or birds, they have to have another way to get rid of the salt. And so sea turtles and seabirds all have a salt gland up by the eye. And it's in a little bit different places in different birds. This is where it is in a gull, right up over the eye. This is where it is in an albatross. And this gland gets active when the bird drinks salt water, and the gland actually enlarges, what we call functional hypertrophy. It gets bigger when the bird's on the ocean, and the salty solution drips down this duct and drips off the bird's beak out into the ocean, whether you're a gull or not a cormorant, sorry, an albatross, or in this case, a loon. So now we're looking down at the top of a loon's head. We've pulled the skin off, and these are the two salt glands. Here's an eye over there, here's an eye over here, and you can see that's one salt gland, that's the other salt gland. And what I've done here is I've pulled one salt gland off, so you can see that little indentation in the skull where the salt gland sits. And the salt gland is connected to a lot of blood vessels because the salt gland has to be able to pull sodium chloride, salt, out of the blood so that the bird can survive on the ocean. So it's like a special extra kidney that's specialized just to get rid of sodium chloride. Okay, we're switching gears again. This is a discussion we've had a lot with LPC and other groups about climate change and how climate change may affect. We've talked about loons on the ocean and the fact that the fish may move, and if loons are molting, they may starve. But what about loons on a lake in the summertime? Because we know that loons are a northern species. They breed in Canada, they breed in New England, they breed in the northern states, Minnesota, Montana, Wisconsin, out to Washington state, but they don't breed in the southern states, and we don't know why. But one thing may have to do with temperature. And the question is, if it's temperature, what part of a loon's life cycle is the most sensitive to an increased temperature? Is it the adult loon or is it the egg? And my working theory at the moment is that it's an egg. And this is a loon egg. That's my hand, just for scale. And if you think about a baby loon developing inside that, any baby bird developing inside the egg, it's got to be able to breathe through the shell. If you look microscopically at an eggshell, there are pores in it. Little microscopic pores that you can see with a microscope. And so the oxygen comes in from the atmosphere, and the bird has to breathe out carbon dioxide. It has to be able to breathe through the eggshell. But if it gets warmer, that chick has more and more trouble breathing through there. The metabolism of the chick goes up, and we may start to find that the eggs simply don't hatch because it's too warm. And of course, we know this from trying to hatch eggs in incubators, whether you're doing chicken eggs at a poultry farm or whether you're doing California condor eggs at a zoo for conservation purposes. Eggs only develop well within a narrow range of humidity and temperature. And if the temperature is too high or the temperature is too low, the eggs won't develop. And so that's one of the things we're concerned about with climate change is, might that affect hatchability of loon eggs? We don't know yet, but LPC is doing some studies on this. Now, I sort of wanted to end with this thought, because this is one of those things that just intrigues me. And I'm hoping somebody out there is way more tech savvy than I am, and can help find this answer. Look at that loon. Gorgeous loon, bright red eye. But one of the things I realized looking at them a while ago when I was talking to my students is, if one loon looks at another loon, what does it see? You see a pattern of white, black and white checkers. This is a living barcode. There's information in those stripes and dots. And I'm sure that the loons are using that information to tell one another apart. And nobody has ever tried to use this living barcode to see if we can identify individual loons. But I bet we can. And so we've done a few beginning experiments, but my tech skills are very limited. I was using free online software. But in penguins, people have used this for the spots in penguins. It's been used in manta rays, whales, polar bears, zebras, toads, salamanders, to use AI and computer image recognition to recognize individual animals. And so one of the questions is, what is it about the loon that other loons are using to recognize? And it may be that it's a bunch of things. Is it the dark spots, as it is in manta rays? That's the name of the software, by the way, I3S Manta. Or is it like the software that's been used to identify zebras, and we've tried this on loons. But one of the problems we have with birds is when they move their body position, the feathers move. And so the black and white patterns move a little bit when their neck is extended versus when their neck is contracted. So we need better ways to come at this. We need a techie person. So what's consistent? The shape of the head can change. The shape of the bill is pretty consistent. We've got the chin strap, we've got the necklace, we've got the shape of spots on the back, we've got the shape of body spots. And the other thing we've got is these stripes up here by the shoulder. And there is one paper published many years ago, not on common loons, but on red-throated loons, that showed in red-throated loons, you can tell with 100% accuracy the males from the females by the number of stripes right there. And nobody's ever looked in common loons. So we took some common loon photos, we digitized all the spots, which was a real pain in the neck, on about 50 of them. We digitized the shape of the beak and the length of the bird. We digitized a bunch of different points on the beak for beak shape. And we found out that, again, using our tech ability, we could tell the majority of loons apart. And so we need somebody who's a lot techier to get involved in this, because I think if we do this, if we can figure out how to do it right and use the information that the loons are using, we may be able to tell a lot more without having to capture the birds, or even without having to put bands on them. We may be able to tell more about individual birds just from their patterns. Now, one thing that we don't know, look at this bird here. We don't know if an individual bird keeps its same pattern from year to year. For instance, if I come back next year, this bird will have molted into a winter plumage and then molted again into a breeding plumage. And so in next year's breeding plumage, is the chin strap the same? Is the necklace the same? Is the back pattern the same? We don't know. Nobody's ever looked from year to year in loons. So there's a lot that we have to look at and a lot to learn. Again, looking at cadavers, I say to myself, what does a loon see when it looks at another loon? We know, for instance, when loons display to one another, they often bring their wings up and they're showing the underside of the wing to another loon. Now, when I look at the underside of a loon wing, you see how each one of these feathers is partly dark and partly light? It's different on every loon. And the white spots on the dorsal surface are different on every loon. And I'm sure the loons are using this information. The white spots here on the wrist are different on every loon. And we have to be smart enough to figure out how to use what the loons are using. So here's what a loon sees when it looks at another loon. They're not looking at the bands. They're looking at the patterns underneath the wing. They're looking at the white spots. They're looking at the stripes. They're looking at the necklaces. They're looking at the beak shape. And I'm sure that this bird can tell from hundreds of yards away, not just that it's a loon, they can tell which loon it is. They can tell if it's a male or a female. They can tell if it's a territory holder. And we've got to figure out ways to take advantage of the information that's in this bird's plumage to study them better and understand them better, because these, of course, are magnificent, wonderful animals, and we want to conserve them far into the future. And we do see a lot of birds that don't have bands. So, we need more information from them too. So that's all I've got on loons. This is a loon in winter plumage. And again, you can see in the winter, that eye's not bright red. So I think I'm done with my slides. I don't know if Carolyn or anybody else is on there, but if there are additional questions, I'm happy to see what we can do.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly, Caroline.
I'm sorry, I had to turn off my video. My internet connection just keeps cutting out. So I was trying to
That's fine.
help with that a little bit.
I was going to turn off my stop share or my PowerPoint because maybe that'll give us more bandwidth.
So we do have some questions in the chat. And if anyone has any, last questions, I encourage you to put them in there now. But we'll just start and, go through them chronologically. So there's one about, loons having trouble walking. And the question is about grebes, actually, and whether they have a similar problem.
Interesting question. And the answer is not as much. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is their leg isn't quite as specialized. They don't have that big nemial tuberosity that loons do. And the other one is that grebes are much smaller birds. They're much lighter weight. And so they can lift more of their bodies up on their legs than common loons can. An interesting thing, there are 5 species of loons, if you think about it. The 2 biggest are the yellow-billed and then the common. And then there's the Pacific and the red-throated and the Arctic. And the smallest loon is the red-throated. And the red-throated can actually take off from very small bodies of water and is the best at walking because it's little and it weighs less. And so it doesn't have as much problems with its legs as the big loons do.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense, though. Questions about loons on the ocean and, when storms come in at sea, are loons affected by those, or how do they deal with that?
Well, one of the problems, and this is true with studying any animal out at sea, is people don't like to be out during storms. And so there aren't very many good studies. And nobody's come up with a way to attach like a mini camera to a loon on the ocean in the winter. We've done that with whales and with sharks and, with some other seabirds like gannets, but loons don't tolerate that. And so what we have to sort of do is extrapolate from what comes up on shore. And, if you have storms in the winter when the loons are molting and are flightless, and again, this typically is true of the southern coast, so Florida, the Carolinas, the Georgia Sea Islands, things like that, you will sometimes have loons coming up onshore after storms. But sometimes it seems as though they've just been blown ashore and they'll rest on the beach for a few hours and then they'll go back in the water and they'll do fine. But if the storms go on for days and days and the water's all turned up, they can't feed themselves. Turbidity, the water clarity is very bad, so they can't find fish. And that's when loons start losing body condition and getting skinny. And unfortunately, one of the terms we use is we say that loons sometimes get into a death spiral. If they're molting and they get skinny, they can't dive as well. And if they can't dive as well, they can't find food. And if they can't find food, they can't grow new feathers. And then they can't dive as well. And so it's like they're circling the drain. And unless they luck out and get into some food relatively quickly, they end up emaciated on the beach and don't make it.
Our next question is, do loons have a nictitating eyelid like eagles and some reptiles do?
They absolutely do. Yeah. Some of the early literature on loons, if you go back to some of the things that were written in the late 1800s and the 20s and 30s and 40s, said that the nictitating membrane in loons might act like a goggle and help them see underwater. And that's shown not to be true. It does protect the eye, absolutely, but it doesn't help with the vision underwater. Whoop, we still there?
I lost you for a second there, but I think the audience did not lose you.
Oh, good. Okay.
And then the last several comments are just, complimentary comments saying this is fascinating and fun to hear about. Great presentation. And I have to agree, Mark, I think you always manage to put together something new and exciting every time we ask you to give a talk. So thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to do this. And, what I'm feeling like I'm doing tonight is sharing my ignorance. What I'm sharing about is not so much what I do know, it's sharing all the things that I wish I knew. We need a geologist, we need a techie person, we need people to come in with some of these skills to help us fill in the blanks so we'll understand loons better. So I hope there's some people out there listening tonight who can contact LPC and get involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have any expertise that you think might be relevant, please do write into us and we can link you up with other folks to hopefully get some good things going here.
That would be great.
We got one last question in.
Okay.
So it says, at what depth of clear...
Whoop, I lost you, Caroline. She'll be back on in a minute. So if people are still listening, we'll just wait until she unfreezes. I'm assuming this is Caroline and not me. Caroline. Caroline. Hello. Caroline, are you there? I didn't hear your question. At what depth something? Hello, hello?
Oh, am I back now?
Yeah, I didn't hear the question. You said at what depth, but then I
Okay.
lost you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
At what depth of clear water does the reduction in light intensity significantly impair the loon's ability to see and chase prey?
It's a great question. I think if, clear water, it depends on how you're measuring it. Um, I don't think the loons dive deeply enough to ever get into a situation where there's not enough light.
Mhm.
For instance, loons have been known in the Great Lakes to dive to depths approaching 200 feet. At 200 feet, all of the red light is filtered out. You only have a few blue and green wavelengths, and yet the loons are able to catch prey at between 150 and 200 feet. So if the water is very clear, I don't think light is probably ever limiting.
Gotcha. Great. Well, thank you again so much, Mark, for sharing all of your knowledge, or, as you've said, your questions with us all. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who, spent some time with us tonight and joined in.
Well, I hope everybody can stay cool and get through this hot summer weather, and we'll hope the loons do too.
Yes.